The Entrepreneurial Society. 1. Every generation needs a new revolution, was Thomas Jefferson's conclusion toward the end of his long life. His contemporary, Goethe, the great German poet, though an arch-conservative, voiced the same sentiment when he sang in his old age, Vernunft wird Unsinn wohl tat Plage. Reason becomes nonsense and boons afflictions. Both Jefferson and Goethe were expressing their generation's disenchantment with the legacy of Enlightenment and French Revolution. But they might just as well have reflected on our present-day legacy 150 years later of that great shining promise, the welfare state, begun in Imperial Germany for the truly indigent and disabled, which has now become everybody's entitlement and an increasing burden on those who produce. Institutions, systems, policies eventually outlive themselves, as do products, processes, and services. They do it when they accomplish their objectives, and they do it when they fail to accomplish their objectives. The mechanisms may still tick, but the assumptions on which they were designed have become invalid, as, for example, have the demographic assumptions on which healthcare plans and retirement schemes were designed in all developed countries over the last 100 years. Then, indeed, reason becomes nonsense and boons afflictions. Yet revolutions, as we have learned since Jefferson's days, are not the remedy. They cannot be predicted, directed, or controlled. They bring to power the wrong people. Worst of all, their results, predictably, are the exact opposite of their promises. Only a few years after Jefferson's death in 1826, that great anatomist of government and politics, Alexis de Tocqueville, pointed out that revolutions do not demolish the prisons of the old regime, they enlarge them. The most lasting legacy of the French Revolution, Tocqueville proved, was the tightening of the very fetters of pre-revolutionary France, the subjection of the whole country to an uncontrolled and uncontrollable bureaucracy, and the centralization in Paris of all political, intellectual, artistic, and economic life. The main consequences of the Russian Revolution were new serfdom for the tillers of the land, an omnipotent secret police, and a rigid, corrupt, stifling bureaucracy, the very features of the Tsarist regime against which Russian liberals and revolutionaries had protested most loudly and with most justification. And the same must be said of Mao's macabre great cultural revolution. Indeed, we now know that revolution is a delusion, the pervasive delusion of the 19th century, but today perhaps the most discredited of its myths. We now know that revolution is not achievement in the new dawn. It results from senile decay, from the bankruptcy of ideas and institutions, from failure of self-renewal. And yet we also know that theories, values, and all artifacts of human minds and human hands do age and rigidify, becoming obsolete, becoming afflictions. Innovation and entrepreneurship are thus needed in society as much as in the economy, in public service institutions as much as in businesses. It is precisely because innovation and entrepreneurship are not root and branch, but one step at a time, a product here, a policy there, a public service yonder, because they are not planned but focused on this opportunity and that need, because they are tentative and will disappear if they do not produce the expected and needed results, because, in other words, they are pragmatic rather than dogmatic and modest rather than grandiose, that they promise to keep any society, economy, industry, public service, or business flexible and self-renewing. They achieve what Jefferson hoped to achieve through revolution in every generation, and they do so without bloodshed, civil war, or concentration camps, without economic catastrophe, but with purpose, with direction, and under control. What we need is an entrepreneurial society in which innovation and entrepreneurship are normal, steady, and continuous. Just as management has become the specific organ of all contemporary institutions and the integrating organ of our society and organizations, so innovation and entrepreneurship have to become an integral life-sustaining activity in our organizations, our economy, our society. This requires of executives in all institutions that they make innovation and entrepreneurship a normal, ongoing, everyday activity, a practice in their own work and in that of their organization. To provide concepts and tools for this task is the purpose of this book. 2. What will not work? The first priority in talking about the public policies and governmental measures needed in the entrepreneurial society is to define what will not work, especially as the policies that will not work are so popular today. Planning, as the term is commonly understood, is actually incompatible with an entrepreneurial society and economy. Innovation does indeed need to be purposeful, and entrepreneurship has to be managed, but innovation almost by definition has to be decentralized, ad hoc, autonomous, specific, and microeconomic. It had better start small, tentative, flexible. Indeed, the opportunities for innovation are found on the whole only way down and close to events. They are not to be found in the massive aggregates with which the planner deals of necessity, but in the deviations therefrom, in the unexpected, in the incongruity, in the difference between the glass is half full and the glass is half empty, in the weak link in a process. By the time the deviation becomes statistically significant, and thereby visible to the planner, it is too late. Innovative opportunities do not come with the tempest, but with the rustling of the breeze. It is popular today, especially in Europe, to believe that a country can have high-tech entrepreneurship by itself. France, West Germany, even England are basing national policies on this premise. But it is a delusion, indeed, a policy that promotes high-tech and high-tech alone, and that otherwise is as hostile to entrepreneurship as France, West Germany, and even England still are, will not even produce high-tech. All it can come up with is another expensive flop, another supersonic Concorde, a little Glar, oceans of red ink, but neither jobs nor technological leadership. High-tech in the first place, and this is, of course, one of the major premises of this book, is only one area of innovation and entrepreneurship. The great bulk of innovations lies in other areas, but also a high-tech policy will run into political obstacles that will defeat it in short order. In terms of job creation, high-tech is the maker of tomorrow rather than the maker of today. As we saw initially, in the introduction, high-tech in the United States created no more jobs in the period 1970 through 85 than Smokestack lost, about 5 to 6 million. All the additional jobs in the American economy during that period, a total of 35 million, were created by new ventures that were not high-tech, but middle-tech, low-tech, or no-tech. The European countries, however, will be under increasing pressure to find additional jobs for a growing workforce. And if then the focus in innovation and entrepreneurship is high-tech, the demand that governments abandon the high-tech policies which sacrifice the needs of today, the bolstering of the ailing industrial giants, to the uncertain promise of a high-tech future will become irresistible. In France, this has been the issue over which the Communists pulled out of President Mitterrand's cabinet in 1984, and the left wing of Mitterrand's own Socialist Party is also increasingly unhappy and restless. Above all, to have high-tech entrepreneurship alone without its being embedded in a broad entrepreneurial economy of no-tech, low-tech, and middle-tech is like having a mountaintop without the mountain. Even high-tech people in such a situation will not take jobs in new risky high-tech ventures. They will prefer the security of a job in the large established safe company or in a government agency. Of course, high-tech ventures need a great many people who are not themselves high-tech, accountants, salespeople, managers, and so on. In an economy that spurns entrepreneurship and innovation except for that tiny extravaganza, the glamorous high-tech venture, those people will keep on looking for jobs and career opportunities where society and economy, that is, their classmates, their parents, and their teachers, encourage them to look, in the large, safe, established institution. Neither will distributors be willing to take on the products of the new venture, nor investors be willing to back it. But the other innovative ventures are also needed to supply the capital that high-tech requires. Knowledge-based innovation, and in particular high-tech innovation, has the longest lead time between investment and profitability. But the other innovative ventures are also needed to supply the capital that high-tech requires. Knowledge-based innovation, and in particular high-tech innovation, has the longest lead time between investment and profitability. The world's computer industry did not break even until the late 70s, that is, after 30 lost years. To be sure, IBM made very good money quite early, and one after another of the seven dwarfs, the smaller American computer makers, moved into the black during the late 60s. But these profits were offset several times over by the tremendous losses of all the others, and especially of the big old companies who failed totally in computers: General Electric, Westinghouse, ITT, and RCA in America, the British General Electric Company, Ferranti and Plessey in Great Britain, Thomson Houston in France, Siemens and Telefunken in Germany, Philips in Holland, and many others. History is repeating itself now in mini-computers and personal computers. It will be many years before the industry worldwide moves into the black. And the same thing is happening in biotechnology. This was also the pattern 100 years ago in the electrical apparatus industry of the 1880s, for instance, or in the automobile industry of 1900 or 1910. And during this long gestation period, non-high-tech ventures have to produce the profits to offset the losses of high-tech and provide the needed capital. The French are right, of course. Economic and political strength these days requires a high-tech position, whether in information technology, in biology, or in automation. The French surely have the scientific and technical capacity, and yet it is most unlikely, I am tempted to say impossible, for any country to be innovative and entrepreneurial in high-tech without having an entrepreneurial economy. High-tech is indeed the leading edge, but there cannot be an edge without a knife. There cannot be a viable high-tech sector by itself, any more than there can be a healthy brain in a dead body. There must be an economy full of innovators and entrepreneurs, with entrepreneurial vision and entrepreneurial values, with access to venture capital, and filled with entrepreneurial vigor. 3. The social innovations needed. There are two areas in which an entrepreneurial society requires substantial social innovation. 1. The first is a policy to take care of redundant workers. The numbers are not large, but blue-collar workers in smokestack industries are concentrated in a very few places. 3/4 of all American automobile workers live in 20 counties, for instance. They are therefore highly visible, and they are highly organized. More important, they are ill-equipped to place themselves, to redirect themselves, to move. They have neither education nor skill nor social competence, and above all not much self-confidence. They never applied for a job throughout their life. When they were ready to go to work, a relative already working in the automobile plant introduced them to the supervisor, or the parish priest gave them a letter to one of his parishioners who was already working in the mill. And the smokestack workers in Great Britain, or the Welsh coal miners, are no different, nor are the blue-collar workers in Germany's Ruhr, in Lorraine, or in the Belgian Borinage. These workers are the one group in developed societies that have not experienced in this century a tremendous growth in education and horizon. In respect to competence, experience, skill, and schooling, they are pretty much where the unskilled laborer of 1900 was. The one thing that has happened to them is an explosive rise in their incomes. On balance, they are the highest paid group in industrial society if wages and benefits are added together, and in political power as well. They therefore do not have enough capacity, whether as individuals or as a group, to help themselves, but more than enough power to oppose, to veto, to impede. Unless society takes care of placing them, if only in lower-paying jobs, they must become a purely negative force. The problem is soluble if an economy becomes entrepreneurial, for then the new businesses of the entrepreneurial economy create new jobs, as has been happening in the United States during the last 10 years. Which explains why the massive unemployment in the old smokestack industries has caused so little political trouble so far in the United States and has not even triggered a massive protectionist reaction. But even if an entrepreneurial economy creates the new jobs, there is need for organized efforts to train and place the redundant former smokestack workers. They cannot do it by themselves. Otherwise, redundant smokestack labor will increasingly oppose anything new, including even the means of their own salvation. The mini-mill offers jobs to redundant steel workers. The automated automobile plant is the most appropriate workplace for displaced automobile workers. And yet both the mini-mill and automation in the car factory are bitterly fought by the present workers, even though they know that their own jobs will not last. Unless we can make innovation an opportunity for redundant workers in the smokestack industries, their feeling of impotence, their fears, and their sense of being caught will lead them to resist all innovation, as is already the case in Great Britain or in the U.S. Postal Service. The job has been done before by the Mitsu Zaibatsu of Japan in the sharp Japanese depression after the Russo-Japanese War of 1906, by the Swedes after World War II in the deliberate policy which converted a country of subsistence farmers and forest workers into an industrialized and highly prosperous nation. And the numbers are, as already said, not very large, especially as we need not concern ourselves overmuch with the 1/3 of the group that is 55 years old and older and has available adequate early retirement provisions, and with another third that is under 30 years of age and capable of moving and of placing themselves. But the policy to train and place the remaining one-third, a small but hard core of displaced smokestack workers, has yet to be worked out. 2. The other social innovation needed is both more radical and more difficult and unprecedented, to organize the systematic abandonment of outworn social policies and obsolete public service institutions. This was not a problem in the last great entrepreneurial era 100 years ago. There were few such policies and institutions. Now we have them in abundance. But by now we also know that few, if any, are forever. Few of them even perform more than a fairly short time. One of the fundamental changes in worldview and perception of the last 20 years, a truly monumental turn, is the realization that governmental policies and agencies are of human rather than of divine origin, and that therefore the one thing certain about them is that they will become obsolete fairly fast. Yet politics is still based on the age-old assumption that whatever government does is grounded in the nature of human society and therefore forever. As a result, there is no political mechanism so far to slough off the old, the outworn, the no longer productive in government. Or rather, what we have is not working yet. In the United States there has lately been a rash of sunset laws, which prescribe that a governmental agency or a public law lapse after a certain period of time, unless specifically reenacted. These laws have not worked, however, in part because there are no objective criteria as to when an agency or a law becomes dysfunctional, in part because there is so far no organized process of abandonment, but perhaps mostly because we have not yet learned to develop new or alternative methods for achieving what an ineffectual law or agency was originally supposed to achieve. To develop both the principles and the process for making sunset laws meaningful and effective is one of the important social innovations ahead of us, and one that needs to be made soon. Our societies are ready for it. 4. The new tasks. These two social policies needed are, however, only examples. Underlying them is the need for a massive reorientation in policies and attitudes, and above all, in priorities. We need to encourage habits of flexibility, of continuous learning, and of acceptance of change as normal and as opportunity, for institutions as well as for individuals. Tax policy is one area, important both for its impact on behavior and as a symbol of society's values and priorities. In developed countries, sloughing off yesterday is at present severely penalized by the tax system. In the United States, for instance, the tax collector treats monies realized by selling or liquidating a business or a product line as income. Actually, the amounts are, of course, repayments of capital, but under the present tax system the company pays corporation income tax on them, and if it distributes the proceeds to its shareholders, they pay full personal income tax on them as if they were ordinary dividends, that is, distribution of profits. As a result, businesses prefer not to abandon the old, the obsolete, the no longer productive. They'd rather hang on to it and keep on pouring money into it. Worse still, they then assign their most capable people to defending the outworn, in a massive misallocation of the scarcest and most valuable resource, the human resource that needs to be allocated to making tomorrow, if the company is to have a tomorrow. And when the company then finally liquidates or sells the old, obsolete, no longer productive business or product line, it does not distribute the proceeds to the shareholders and does not therefore return them to the capital market where they become available for investment in innovative entrepreneurial opportunities. Rather, the company keeps these funds and commonly invests them in its old, traditional, declining business or products, that is, into those parts of its operations and activities for which it could not easily raise money on the capital market, again, resulting in a massive misallocation of scarce resources. What is needed in an entrepreneurial society is a tax system that encourages moving capital from yesterday into tomorrow, rather than one that, like our present one, prevents and penalizes it. But we should also be able, in and through the tax system, to assuage the most pressing financial problem of the new and growing business, cash shortage. One way might be acceptance of economic reality. During the first 5 or 6 years of the life of a new and particularly of a growing business, profits are an accounting fiction. During these years, the costs of staying in business are always, and almost by definition, larger for a new venture than the surplus from yesterday's operations, that is, the excess of current income over yesterday's costs. This means in effect that a new and growing venture always has to invest every penny of operating surplus to stay alive. Usually, especially if growing fast, it has to invest a good deal more than it can possibly hope to produce as current surplus, that is, as profit, in its current accounts. For the first few years of its life, the new and growing venture, whether standing by itself or part of an existing enterprise, should therefore be exempt from income taxes, for the same reason for which we do not expect a small and rapidly growing child to produce a surplus that supports a grown-up. And taxes are the means by which a producer supports somebody else, namely, a non-producer. By the way, exempting the new venture from taxation until it is grown up would almost certainly in the end produce a substantially higher tax yield. If this, however, is deemed too radical, the new venture should at least be able to postpone paying taxes on the so-called profits of its infant years. It should be able to retain the cash until it is past the period of acute cash flow pressure, and to do so without penalty or interest charges. Altogether, an entrepreneurial society and economy require tax policies that encourage the formation of capital. Surely one secret of the Japanese is their officially encouraged tax evasion on capital formation. Legally, a Japanese adult is allowed one medium-sized savings account, the interest on which is tax-exempt. Actually, Japan has 5 times as many such accounts as there are people in the country, children and minors included. This is, of course, a scandal against which newspapers and politicians rail regularly, but the Japanese are very careful not to do anything to stop the abuse. As a result, they have the world's highest rate of capital formation. This may be considered too circuitous a way to escape the dilemma of modern society, the conflict between the need for capital formation at a high rate and the popular condemnation of interest and dividends as unearned income and capitalist, if not as sinful and wicked. But one way or another, any country that wants to remain competitive in an entrepreneurial era will have to develop tax policies which do what the Japanese do by means of semi-official hypocrisy, encourage capital formation. Just as important as tax and fiscal policies that encourage entrepreneurship, or at least do not penalize it, is protection of the new venture against the growing burden of governmental regulations, restrictions, reports, and paperwork. My own prescription, though I have no illusion of its ever being accepted, would be to allow the new venture, whether an independent enterprise or part of an existing one, to charge the government for the costs of regulations, reports, and paperwork that exceed a certain proportion, say 5% of the new venture's gross revenues. This would be particularly helpful to new ventures in the public service sector, for example, a freestanding clinic for ambulatory surgery. In developed countries, public service institutions are even more heavily burdened by governmental red tape, and even more loaded down with doing chores for the government than are businesses, and they are even less able, as a rule, to shoulder the burden whether in money or in people. Such a policy, by the way, would be the best, perhaps the only, remedy for that dangerous and insidious disease of developed countries, the steady growth in the invisible cost of government. It is a real cost in money and, even more, in capable people, their time, and their efforts. The cost is invisible, however, since it does not show in governmental budgets, but is hidden in the accounts of the physician whose nurse spends half her time filling out governmental forms and reports, in the budget of the university, where 16 high-level administrators work on compliance with governmental mandates and regulations, or in the profit and loss statement of the small business 19 of whose 275 employees, while being paid by the company, actually work as tax collectors for the government, deducting taxes and Social Security contributions from the pay of their fellow workers, collecting tax identification numbers of suppliers and customers and reporting them to the government, or, as in Europe, collecting value-added tax, VAT. And these invisible governmental overheads are totally unproductive. Does anyone, for instance, believe that tax accountants contribute to national wealth or to productivity, and altogether add to society's well-being, whether material, physical, or spiritual? And yet, in every developed country, government mandates misallocation of a steadily growing proportion of our scarcest resource, able, diligent, trained people to such essentially sterile pursuits. It may be too much to hope that we can arrest, let alone excise, the cancer of government's invisible costs, but at least we should be able to protect the new entrepreneurial venture against it. We need to learn to ask in respect to any proposed new governmental policy or measure, does it further society's ability to innovate? Does it promote social and economic flexibility? Or does it impede and penalize innovation and entrepreneurship? To be sure, impact on society's ability to innovate cannot and should not be the determining, let alone the sole criterion, but it needs to be taken into consideration before a new policy or a new measure is enacted, and today it is not taken into account in any country, except perhaps in Japan, or by any policymaker. 5. The individual in entrepreneurial society. In an entrepreneurial society, individuals face a tremendous challenge, a challenge they need to exploit as an opportunity, the need for continuous learning and relearning. In traditional society, it could be assumed, and was assumed, that learning came to an end with adolescence, or, at the latest, with adulthood. What one had not learned by age 21 or so, one would never learn. But also what one had learned by age 21 or so would apply, unchanged, the rest of one's life. On these assumptions, traditional apprenticeship was based, traditional crafts, traditional professions, but also the traditional systems of education and the schools. Crafts, professions, systems of education and schools are still, by and large, based on these assumptions. There were, of course, always exceptions, some groups that practiced continuous learning and relearning, the great artists and the great scholars, Zen monks, mystics, and the Jesuits. But these exceptions were so few that they could safely be ignored. In an entrepreneurial society, however, these exceptions become the exemplars. The correct assumption in an entrepreneurial society is that individuals will have to learn new things well after they have become adults, and maybe more than once. The correct assumption is that what individuals have learned by age 21 will begin to become obsolete 5 to 10 years later and will have to be replaced, or at least refurbished, by new learning, new skills, new knowledge. One implication of this is that individuals will increasingly have to take responsibility for their own continuous learning and relearning, for their own self-development, and for their own careers. They can no longer assume that what they have learned as children and youngsters will be the foundation for the rest of their lives. It will be the launching pad, the place to take off from, rather than the place to build on and to rest on. They can no longer assume that they enter upon a career, which then proceeds along a predetermined, well-mapped, and well-lighted career path to a known destination, what the American military calls progressing in grade. The assumption from now on has to be that individuals on their own will have to find, determine, and develop a number of careers during their working lives. And the more highly schooled the individuals, the more entrepreneurial their careers and the more demanding their learning challenges. The carpenter can still assume, perhaps, that the skills he acquired as apprentice and journeyman will serve him 40 years later. Physicians, engineers, metallurgists, chemists, accountants, lawyers, teachers, managers had better assume that the skills, knowledges, and tools they will have to master and apply 15 years hence are going to be different and new. Indeed, they better assume that 15 years hence they will be doing new and quite different things, will have new and different goals, and indeed, in many cases, different careers. And only they themselves can take responsibility for the necessary learning and relearning, and for directing themselves. Tradition, convention, and corporate policy will be a hindrance rather than a help. This also means that an entrepreneurial society challenges habits and assumptions of schooling and learning. The educational systems the world over are in the main extensions of what Europe developed in the 17th century. There have been substantial additions and modifications, but the basic architectural plan on which our schools and universities are built goes back 300 years and more. Now new, in some cases radically new thinking, and new, in some cases radically new approaches are required, and on all levels. Using computers in preschool may turn out to be a passing fad, but 4-year-olds exposed to television expect, demand, and respond to very different pedagogy than 4-year-olds did 50 years ago. Young people headed for a profession, that is 4/5 of today's college students, do need a liberal education. But that clearly means something quite different from the 19th century version of the 17th century curriculum that passed for a liberal education in the English-speaking world, or for Allgemeinbildung in Germany. If this challenge is not faced up to, we risk losing the fundamental concept of liberal education altogether, and will descend into the purely vocational, purely specialized, which would endanger the educational foundation of the community and, in the end, community itself. But also educators will have to accept that schooling is not for the young only, and the greatest challenge, but also the greatest opportunity for the school, is the continuing relearning of already highly schooled adults. So far we have no educational theory for these tasks. So far we have no one who does what in the 17th century the great Czech educational reformer Johann Comenius did, or what the Jesuit educators did when they developed what to this day is the modern school and the modern university. But in the United States, at least, practice is far ahead of theory. To me, the most positive development in the last 20 years, and the most encouraging one, is the ferment of educational experimentation in the United States, a happy byproduct of the absence of a Ministry of Education in respect to the continuing learning and relearning of adults, and especially of highly schooled professionals. Without a master plan, without educational philosophy, and indeed without much support from the educational establishment, the continuing education and professional development of already highly educated and highly achieving adults has become the true growth industry in the United States in the last 20 years. The emergence of the entrepreneurial society may be a major turning point in history. 100 years ago, the worldwide panic of 1873 terminated the century of laissez-faire that had begun with the publication of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations in 1776. In the panic of 1873, the modern welfare state was born. 100 years later, it had run its course, almost everyone now knows. It may survive despite the demographic challenges of an aging population and a shrinking birth rate, but it will survive only if the entrepreneurial economy succeeds in greatly raising productivities. We may even still make a few minor additions to the welfare edifice, put on a room here or a new benefit there, but the welfare state is past rather than future, as even the old liberals now know. Will its successor be the entrepreneurial society? The pervasive delusion of the 19th century, but today perhaps the most discredited of its myths. We now know that revolution is not achievement in the new dawn. It results from senile decay, from the bankruptcy of ideas and institutions, from failure of self-renewal. And yet we also know that theories, values, and all artifacts of human minds and human hands do age and rigidify, becoming obsolete, becoming afflictions. Innovation and entrepreneurship are thus needed in society as much as in the economy, in public service institutions as much as in businesses. It is precisely because in a welfare state, begun in Imperial Germany for the truly indigent and disabled, which has now become everybody's entitlement and an increasing burden on those who produce. Institutions, systems, policies eventually outlive themselves, as do products, processes, and services. They do it when they accomplish their objectives, and they do it when they fail to accomplish their objectives. The mechanisms may still tick, but the assumptions on which they were designed have become invalid, as, for example, have the demographic assumptions on which healthcare plans and retirement schemes were designed in all developed countries over the last 100 years. Then, indeed, reason becomes nonsense and boons afflictions. Yet revolutions, as we have learned since Jefferson's days, are not the remedy. They cannot be predicted, directed, or controlled. They bring to power the wrong people. Worst of all, their results, predictably, are the exact opposite of their promises. Only a few years after Jefferson's death in 1826, that great anatomist of government and politics, Alexis de Tocqueville, pointed out that revolutions do not demolish the prisons of the old regime, they enlarge them. The most lasting legacy of the French Revolution, Tocqueville proved, was the tightening of the very fetters of pre-revolutionary France, the subjection of the whole country to an uncontrolled and uncontrollable bureaucracy, and the centralization in Paris of all political, intellectual, artistic, and economic life. The main consequences of the Russian Revolution were new serfdom for the tillers of the land, an omnipotent secret police, and a rigid, corrupt, stifling bureaucracy, the very features of the Tsarist regime against which Russian liberals and revolutionaries had protested most loudly and with most justification. And the same must be said of Mao's macabre great cultural revolution. Indeed, we now know that revolution is a delusion. The entrepreneurial society. 1. Every generation needs a new revolution, was Thomas Jefferson's conclusion toward the end of his long life. His contemporary, Goethe, the great German poet, though an arch-conservative, voiced the same sentiment when he sang in his old age, Vernunft wird Unsinn voltat plaga. Reason becomes nonsense and boons afflictions. Both Jefferson and Goethe were expressing their generation's disenchantment with the legacy of enlightenment and French Revolution. but they might just as well have reflected on our present-day legacy 150 years later of that great shining promise the